We have a fresh jobs report out this month, and this is going to be the last jobs report to be released before the election. Financial media is only there to pump up the stock market, and there's nobody out there to inform the masses, except for a few here on YouTube. I listen to Money GPS, Bull Boom Bear Bust. So here's the chart. We can see that those that are on temporary layoff dropped. 1.5 million people are no longer on a temporary layoff. Now, some of those ended up becoming permanent job losers. So we've got 300,000 more people losing their jobs permanently. And I have circled that to show that about 4 million people have permanently lost their jobs. That's a lot of people. Many of those that are on a temporary layoff are going into industries like retail and hospitality that are under pressure. This snippet out of MarketWatch did a pretty good job of talking about how temporary layoffs are becoming permanent job losses. According to the Q2 2020 Yelp Economic Average Report, in April 2020, 79% of closed businesses said they were closing temporarily, while 21% announced permanent closings. Over the months that followed, the number of permanently closed businesses have steadily grown. By July, we saw the number of permanently closed businesses rise to more than 50% of the total number announced closings. So we are seeing a surge in permanently closed businesses and permanent job losses. It all fits in with the data. So here's where we look at lost their jobs and are unemployed for 27 weeks or over. That jumped by 50%. We went from 1.6 million people who'd been unemployed for 27 weeks and up to 2.4 million. And where is 27 weeks out from the beginning of October? That takes us to the end of March. So right now, this is basically starting to encapsulate a lot of the people who'd lost their jobs in March. But think about all the people who'd been losing their jobs in April, May, June, July, August, September. I mean, we've been losing 1 million or so jobs, right? Initial claims for unemployment have been hovering in that 1 million range for a long time. We are going to see the number of unemployed, the long-term unemployed, grow to an absurd amount. So this is the same chart as the last one, except it just looks at the percent distribution. And the long-term unemployed right now represent 19% of all unemployed people. So 1 out of 5 persons that is unemployed at the moment is unemployed for more than 27 weeks. In May, that was just 5%. So this is just going insane. In fact, if we look at May, 10.8% of people were unemployed from 15 weeks and over. 10.7. Okay. Right now, that's 58% more. So, are these folks going to be able to get their jobs back? I mean, it is already pretty hard for, people to get jobs when they have gaps in their employment. We've heard a lot about women struggling the most during the illness. It is true that more women have dropped out of the labor force than men. Men, it was about 2.2 million men are out of the labor force as compared to a year ago. With women, it's almost 3 million. But what I thought was kind of interesting when I looked at this chart was there are twice as many men right now discouraged as there were a year ago. Whereas with women, it's only gone up, about 30% or so. So men are way more likely to be discouraged now than they were a year ago versus women. Another thing to look at here is that there are about 1 million fewer men holding multiple jobs and about 1 million fewer women holding multiple jobs, meaning they had 2 or 3 or 4 jobs, and now they only have 1. The biggest drop for women, about 60% of the women who are no longer multiple job holders, about 60% of them at one point had a primary job, was full-time, and their secondary job was part-time. So you had a part-time job on top of your full-time job, and you've lost or maybe even quit your part-time job. The reason why I think this is important, if you had a secondary part-time job in addition to your full-time job and you lose that part-time job, either quitting because you need to stay at home with your family, your kids are doing online learning, or the secondary job no longer exists, you're still not considered unemployed. But you probably relied on that secondary job. By losing that secondary job, your household has less income to work with. And this is at a time when inflation is eating into all of your cash. So what this tells me is that households are increasingly strapped for cash. And just looking at the unemployment rate is not going to do justice. Labor force participation rate also dropped by 0.3%. Another casualty is P.F. Chang's. 5,800 workers are slated for potential layoffs. At least they say it's temporary. And it affects several states. 50 to 80 layoffs per store is potentially laying off here. An iconic restaurant in Central Park, the Boathouse restaurant, is giving 163 people permanent layoffs. This is coming to a restaurant near you. I mean, major restaurants, chains like P.F. Chang's, a popular restaurant like the Boathouse, they can't succeed in this kind of an environment. And even if they are allowed to open, what are they going to be allowed to only have 50% capacity? No indoor dining potentially. Winter is coming. I mean, there's just too much uncertainty going on just from the illness. And then you've got, who can afford to eat out at restaurants? Right? Everybody's getting strapped here, and jobs are going away. Take a look at this article. It said at least a quarter of the 28,000 layoffs planned for Disney's Parks division will come from Florida. They came up with the number of 6,390. That's how many non-union Disney employees in Florida will be laid off. And what they tried to figure out is how many auxiliary jobs, non-Disney related jobs, are going to be laying off people because of this layoff, right? It has a cascading effect. So if nobody is going to Disney World, then nobody needs to take an Uber, nobody needs to go to the hotels nearby. Restaurants in the area are also going to be losing their job. And so what they found was that 6,700 jobs is massive. There are only 10 companies in Central Florida that even have that many employees on their payroll. With one swing of Mickey's corporate axe, Disney laid off more people than SeaWorld or Valencia College even employ. Yet, 6,700 is just the tip of our unemployment iceberg. That's just Disney's non-union job losses announced so far, and only at Disney. State records show that Hilton has announced plans to shed 3,600 jobs at local properties. Universal Orlando is shedding at least 2,300 jobs, a workforce larger than all of Full Sail University. It goes on and on. 1,900 at Rosen Resorts, another 1,900 at Marriott Properties, 1,900 at SeaWorld, 1,300 at the Gaylord Palms, 1,000 at Hyatt. Collectively, we're talking more than 30,000 people just from the recent mass layoffs at major tourism employers. So for 7,000 Disney jobs lost in Florida, we've got 30,000 jobs lost total. Hardworking families find themselves at an Orlando food bank. Villa worked at Disney. Her husband still has a job, but the family of four trying to adjust during the pandemic and provide for their 2 children. Disney recently announced earlier this week 28,000 layoffs nationwide. It's been individuals that worked at theme parks, people whose companies closed. So now they don't know how to make ends meet. Folks are getting their layoff notices one week and are at food banks the next week. This just shows that families have been living paycheck to paycheck, and without a paycheck or even just a drop in hours and a drop in income is causing them to go to food banks. Venezuela's food chain is breaking and millions go hungry. This is an article out of Wall Street Journal. It says that 13% of children under 5 are stunted. And here on this little table here, it says the top 10 worst food crises in 2019 by number of people in crisis or worse. So this is before the illness, before the worldwide shutdowns. Yemen, Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Venezuela, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Syria, Sudan, Northern Nigeria, and Haiti. To put it into perspective, the number of people that are hungry in Yemen, which is leading their charts, 15.9 million, is still far less than the number of Americans right now that say they cannot afford to feed their families. Here it says a recent survey taken by the U.S. Census Bureau in August found that 10.5% or 22.3 million adults cannot afford to feed their families. So the United States is in a pretty bad shape. And this is 10.5% of adults, right? And that represents, when you include their kids, there's a bigger chunk of Americans that are food insecure, that are going to be dependent on food banks or food stamps. And here where it says that 13% of children under 5 are stunted in Venezuela, I mean, it seems like we are heading towards Venezuela status, if not for food stamps and food banks. As the price of food continues to go up, the ability for donations to these food banks is going to struggle. You can't donate as much food when the prices are higher. And if there is a shock to the supply chain as demand dries up just naturally, the supply chain could also dwindle, or we could start exporting it to countries that are richer than us. An analysis released last week by Feeding America projects a 6 billion to 8 billion meal shortfall over the next 12 months. The total need for charitable food over the next year, Feeding America estimates, will reach 17 billion pounds, more than 3 times last year's distribution.